Hey, lovely. Welcome to the Kinky Coffee Break. Grab a cuppa and listen in as I chat with some special guests from the world of conscious sexuality and beyond. Some of the chats will be about kink, but it's just as likely that we'll be talking about a wide range of perspectives and lived experiences, all about exploring hidden parts of ourselves or different ways to be in connection. I'm Lex, and I'm an embodiment-focused kink and sex educator, and I support people to explore topics around sexuality, pleasure, intimacy, identity, and relating. A big focus of my work is around how kink, done ethically, can be used as a route to empowerment and for us to become whole, integrated humans. As you might expect from a podcast on these topics, these chats may contain explicit language, descriptions of sexual acts, and themes that may be challenging to hear. Remember, listen to your body and choose what feels good for you. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome back to another episode of the Kinky Coffee Break. I'm Lex, and today I am joined by the wonderful Catherine Hale. So I have been aware of Catherine for a good few years now, since I sort of entered this world doing my training as a sexological body worker. And I kind of was seeing Catherine as someone who was really setting the bar in terms of like how facilitators, how practitioners understand and work with the nervous system and trauma. So you've kind of been in my field of vision for a while, and I've kind of been in awe of your work. So I'm really, really happy that I get to interview you on the podcast. So thank you so much for coming along, first of all. And would you like to tell people who you are and what you do?
Oh, thank you, Lex. What a lovely introduction so far.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I do? I mean, it's such a broad question. But perhaps I'll share a little bit of my journey. So about 12 years ago, I started to explore conscious sexuality. I was training to be a psychotherapist at the time, and very quickly realized that the lack of embodiment in my psychotherapy training just wasn't going to work for me. So I went on a very deep dive into Tantra, conscious sexuality, sexual shamanism, and then started to facilitate group spaces and do one-to-one work. And then about 2017, I think I did the sexological bodywork training. And so at that time, I was doing a lot of one-to-one work with people, mostly people who identified as women. And they would come to me, and the number one problem that they had was an inability to orgasm. But what was interesting was that when I started to work with all of these women, was that underneath that problem was actually a nervous system that was really traumatized, a body that was really traumatized, a nervous system that was very dysregulated. And so then I was like, well, I actually need to train. I need to understand trauma. I need to understand the nervous system in order to be able to really fully help these people, because teaching a technique wasn't really going to kind of solve the problem that they were really coming with. So then I did like many years of trauma resolution training. I studied a few different modalities. And that's been a wild and wonderful journey. My own healing has been a big part of that. And really through that whole journey of this 12, maybe it's even 13 years now, I've lost track. What became very obvious to me was a lot of the spaces that were being held for intimacy and sexuality were some of the most uninformed spaces around trauma. And, there'd be themes of like power imbalances being played out in these spaces, and just a real lack of understanding around the nuance of the nervous system. So people were kind of going in to have healing experiences, transformational experiences, spending a lot of money, but coming out like way more traumatized than when they went in. And so I've kind of spent the last kind of probably 3 or 4 years looking at like, well, how do I address that problem without tackling it head on? What's the remedy to that problem? And so I've been building together my own body of work, which is now a certified trauma-informed training for professionals. So I had to go through all of those experiences to get to this place where I'm at now. And one of my passions is to support people who are holding space for others, particularly in the intimacy and sexuality field, to create safer spaces so that deeper transformation can happen.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I'm hearing that, and I feel kind of my response to my body is like one of like feeling soothed and feeling like relief and hope that that you are doing this work, because I similarly to you, have encountered lots of spaces where people are dropping into exploring sexuality or intimacy, which I think inherently has like so much vulnerability in it, and those spaces just not really even considering like how people's nervous systems are or how they can support regulation of those. It's like that tendency towards creating like extreme experiences rather than like what is that person actually going to be able to process or integrate in their body. I feel really hopeful, and I feel like everyone should be looking at this. And I think one of the things that stands out to me is that it's not only sort of practitioners and facilitators, although that it sounds like that's your focus, but I think we're talking about trauma today, this big topic in this episode, and I think it feels important to say that this is something I think we could all benefit from having a better understanding of, whether that's trauma or more broadly our nervous system responses. And I feel like that awareness is kind of creeping into the mainstream now about, people are understanding or using terminology around trauma more and more. But like, where do we begin? Where do we begin with this massive topic? Let's start with, what do we even mean when we're talking about trauma? And then maybe we could go a little bit more into the nervous system as well, for people who maybe haven't really come across that language so much. So what does it mean to you when we talk about trauma?
Yeah. I want to kind of go back one step, which is to kind of put a little bit of context into that, which is up until about 10 years ago, we weren't talking about trauma. Or if we were, we had a very limited understanding of it. And so we would think that trauma was the thing that happened to you when you had an accident, right? So say you were in a car accident and, you had injuries, and we would say, well, you had a traumatic experience. And for sure, that is a trauma. It's a type of trauma. But what we've become to understand, particularly in the last 10 years, is the nuance of trauma. And so, trauma is something that happens, that we experience in our bodies, that we felt it was too much, too fast, too soon, too overwhelming for our system to be able to experience it and to integrate it. And so what happens is that we then have experiences, whether they're big experiences like, having an accident, or whether they're micro experiences where something happens that's not kind of digestible in that moment, and it remains lodged in our system
Mm.
And it impacts how we then feel, how we relate, and how we behave.
Mm.
And unprocessed trauma, so these traumas that get lodged in the system, have an impact on our nervous system.
Mm.
And they can be the primary cause of what we would call dysregulation in our nervous system.
Mm.
And whilst I've talked about trauma kind of being in the body, which it very much is, but trauma also impacts how we think.
Mm.
It impacts our kind of psyche, our psychological processes.
Mm.
It impacts us at our connection to our spiritual world. It
Mm.
impacts us at the level of our ability to connect with our sexuality.
Mm.
So it's like in the body, but throughout the whole system,
Yeah.
trauma gets lodged and it
Yeah.
impacts us.
Mm. Yeah, and I think what like strikes me with the way trauma impacts people is you don't necessarily always know what those things were that were too much and too fast or too overwhelming. And sometimes, people want to kind of get to the root of it or understand it. But even if you are experiencing this kind of dysregulation and you don't know what's caused it, it's still possible to do some work around your nervous system. So you don't have to kind of have a specific singular event that you know of that caused this. And when we look at it through that lens of these things that were too much or too fast or too big, it kind of it makes it more and more obvious that a lot of us, if not all of us, are carrying around some form of trauma in our body that isn't, these big single events that you mentioned, like that we used to think trauma was.
100%. 100%. And I want to add another layer of understanding into trauma, which is trauma isn't in the event, it's
Mm.
how it impacts you, which means
Mm.
that two people can have an identical experience,
Mm.
and one of them has zero trauma and the other has complex PTSD afterwards, right?
Mhm.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm.
So it's how your system responds to the experience rather than the experience itself.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when we understand that, we can then, to come back to the point that you were making about, this isn't about needing to kind of know the experience that we had, but our body is communicating with us the whole time about what it's holding. And what the body does, it creates sensations, emotions, it creates symptoms that are telling us that we have experienced trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we look at those symptoms, emotions, and sensations, it's like, great, that's all the data that we need to be able to do the repair work to heal the trauma.
Mm. Mm. And you mentioned that, what kind of, or part of the thing that set you off on this path to learn more about trauma was working with a lot of female identifying clients who were unable to orgasm. So that could be one way that it's presenting itself. Kind of, could you give some examples of other ways that you see trauma presenting? Because I think some of the people listening to this might be thinking, this just isn't relevant to me. I haven't experienced these things.
Yeah.
But just to kind of give a flavor of like the wide variety of ways that you were saying, like this data is coming from our body, how much.
I mean, there's so much data that we can use. So let me split it into two categories. So in the nervous system, we can tend to either dysregulate into a hyper response, so we get faster, or we can dysregulate into a hypo response and we go slower and kind of collapse in ourselves. And so the symptoms that we might experience in those two different states are quite different. And so, a symptom of being in a hyper response might be anxiety. And anxiety can present itself as fast thoughts that circulate. It can be a contraction and tightness in the body, a sense of urgency, which may show up in the way in which you approach your work. Like, I have to get this done. It's kind of like the hamster in the wheel experience. For those people that tend to be more in a collapsed state, that's where we tend to get to see more chronic symptoms. So that's where we're going to find things like fibromyalgia. We're going to see chronic fatigue. We're going to see kind of like symptoms that just don't seem to want to go away, and that we can go to our GP with, and we just can't seem to get to the root cause of the problem. So it's like persistent, ongoing chronic health challenges. We might also be checked out. So the way that we're kind of coping with this distress in our body is to zone out and to watch like Netflix for 8 hours, or 2 hours, or we're just doing activities that stop us from feeling. So we're numbing out. So alcohol, sugar, recreational drugs are all ways in which we can numb out and not feel our true feelings and our true sensations.
Yeah, I really like the way that you describe that or explain that through the two kind of broad categories. They feel really relatable, and I can definitely see parts of myself in both of those in different phases of my life. Yeah, and I really appreciate that you touched upon the kind of the hamster wheel, like always on, always working, because I think that is something that's really common. I see that in a lot of people, a lot of my clients as well, and they generally will be the kind of clients who don't think that they've experienced trauma, or don't feel that they've experienced feelings of unsafety. So these kind of things that come up in my intake process, they're generally that category of people who, like, they don't think they have anything to talk about there, but they're really stuck in that, like, actually I can't stop working. I just don't want to stop. And I can relate to that, like having a kind of workaholic background in my corporate days, and a lot of that was like avoiding feeling. Not saying that's the same for everyone, but like just seeing myself in some of what you're describing, and then seeing that in clients now of like, that this absolute terror about slowing down enough to feel things.
Yeah. And just to kind of speak into that a little bit, which is that the prevalent culture that we live in puts so much pressure on us to earn the money to be able to pay for the lives that we live. And then, the impact of the education system on us that kind of, forces us into ways of being and ways of working that are highly pressurized. And how, as a culture, we see that as a measure of success.
Yeah.
So like there's like the personal experience within the collective experience. And so that's why so many people think that they don't have trauma, because we're all swimming together in a sea of collective trauma.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah, that's so true. Yeah, I think about this a lot, about how, the way that a lot of us experience our day-to-day lives in society, like all of the hallmarks of what you were describing earlier can cause trauma for us. This like too much, too fast, too soon, not enough time to process it. All of these things, like that's kind of how our lives are designed now. Like you say, the capitalist way of working, but also like, one of the ways that people numb out, and myself included, can be to like pick up my phone and
Oh
just like
yeah.
scroll on social media. And it's a way of kind of numbing out, probably because I'm feeling overwhelmed. But in doing so, I'm overwhelming myself with even more information and feelings and all the stuff that stirs up. And then we hop straight back into something else, like the next doing thing that we have to do. And so many things about the way that we're living seem to keep us in this state of being overwhelmed and like with really kind of frazzled nervous systems. And like if I think about this through the lens of, power, because that's how I kind of like think about most things, it's like we live in a society that actually disempowers us, because when we are so overwhelmed and we don't have capacity, we can't as easily notice what's going on in our bodies and choose what we want to do or how we want to be. And so it's like it is definitely perpetuating this,
Mm.
it seems, for so many people. But I love that how you said that a lot of people don't notice it because we're so embedded in collective trauma. It can feel radical to step off the hamster wheel
Absolutely.
and so
Absolutely.
notice while you're just running. Yeah, gosh.
Yeah.
Mm. And so that kind of brings it back to me around, you know, learning about trauma, learning about our nervous systems is, it's super, super important for practitioners and space holders. But then it becomes relevant for all of us,
Mm.
because if we are going out into the world and meeting other people, but even not, even just like knowing ourselves, like it's really helpful for us to understand how our
Mm.
nervous systems work, how that's impacting um, our ability to know what we want, or the choices that we're making around, the ways that we numb out, or how we are in relationships. It impacts everything. So where do people begin if they're
Mm.
listening to this now and they're like, yeah, I am on that hamster wheel, or, oh yeah, I do seem to numb out a lot around things. Like, what would you say are some ways for them to start thinking about this, or
Mm.
start maybe making some shifts
Yeah.
in their lives?
Well, the first thing is the awareness, right? It's like, this is my pattern. I tend to go fast, or this is my pattern. I tend to numb out. And
Mm-hmm.
we bring that awareness with a big dollop of compassion, without
Mm-hmm.
any judgment or self-criticism. But it's like, oh wow, I'm in the hamster wheel again. Like, and this is how it feels to be in the hamster wheel. I've got this tightness in my body. Everything's going really, really fast. I feel like there's not enough time. Or alternatively, here I am in the collapse state, and I've numbed out and I've eaten like a big bag of like kettle chips, which I wasn't even hungry. And here I am in the pattern. So that's the first step, is just like the awareness. And then when we have that awareness with a big dollop of compassion, we can start to bring in a little bit of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, I've just eaten that whole packet of kettle chips. What was I trying to kind of not feel in myself? What was I kind of literally like stuffing down
Mm-hmm.
and not feeling in myself? Like, is
Mm-hmm.
there any kind of like sense of that in my system? And it might be like, oh yeah, there's like some sadness here. When was the last time I actually cried? Or, wow, there's a longing for connection, and I don't really know how to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or conversely, if we're kind of like in the speed, then the question we might ask ourselves is like, wow, I notice I'm going really fast. What would it be like to just slow down just a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Can I allow slowness to be here, but not like jumping from fast to really slow, because again, that's like can be really dysregulating. But it's more like, can I slow down enough to notice what's happening in my system?
Mm-hmm.
What is this what this momentum of fast, what's that driven by? Oh, wow, I feel really scared. I feel really scared that I'm not good enough. And so I'm going really, really fast in order to avoid that feeling.
Mm.
And so then what would it be like to actually sit with that feeling of I don't feel good enough? Can I create the space for that? And so we start coming into relationship with ourselves in a more profound, more beautiful way. And so that these mechanisms of checking out or going really fast become redundant over time because there aren't these kind of unconscious needs or unconscious parts with needs that are running the show anymore. But it takes kind of like heaps of compassion and like real curiosity about our inner experience. And we're not taught how to do that.
So true.
Because it's like, can be really scary.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how to deal with that grief. I don't know how to deal with that fear. I don't know how to deal with that self-judgment. Feel ill-equipped to be in this territory. And, you know, a lot of the experiences that are kind of sitting in our system, waiting for us to meet, were experiences that happened to us when we were much younger and where we weren't supported. And so often when we start coming into our inner landscape, we actually need someone else to support us to go into these places. And so whether that's a community of people who you can do this work with, trusted allies, a therapist, a coach, a workshop space. It's like, you know, our part of our cultural conditioning is that we have to do it all alone, which is another trauma.
Yeah.
So whilst I'm inviting people to kind of come in and notice and feel, I'm also inviting being supported in that experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And what comes to mind is that, you know, that piece around like we can't heal relational stuff outside of relationship. We can't do that solo.
Yeah.
And I think like framing it in the way of like these young parts of ourselves that had a need or were overwhelmed or were struggling with something and it wasn't held at the time, like we can to a certain degree sit with that part and be compassionate and listen and go, okay, I hear you, you know, you're afraid right now that if you stop that you're going to get in trouble or something bad's going to happen. But there is that really vital piece of like, and someone that needs to hold us. Someone needs to, whether that's talking about it or sharing those experiences or physically being held by someone. It can look like many different things. But yeah, I really hear that and resonate with that sense of, you know, this important first piece of like noticing our patterns, noticing the feelings with like so much compassion, because that's another bit that I think if I go back, you know, in my sort of journey around this stuff, I think initially, you know, coming into this without that kind of trauma awareness, without the nervous system awareness, you know, I'd notice patterns in myself and I'd meet them with like anger or shame. You know, I'd be so nasty to myself, really, of like, oh, you know, you've just gone and done that again. You've eaten the big bag of crisps or you've had loads of chocolate because you know, whatever's going on. But like, it's shifting that, like bringing in that compassion. And that then for me has allowed the curiosity that you mentioned of like, okay, I do seem to do that sometimes. I do seem to, I don't know, eat the crisps, eat the chocolate, or I do seem to like scroll on my phone and then feel worse after it. What is that need? What is the real need underneath it? But yeah, then there's only so much that you can do on your own. And I really love that invitation to kind of then reach out in the vulnerability of it. And in doing so, that also then, in a way, models that for other people.
Totally.
You know, we're all feeling these things in different ways. They might show up in different ways, but yeah, we're all really vulnerable underneath all of the ways that we, portray ourselves as successful or resilient or whatever. And like, I feel like it's a bit of an olive branch to other people when we say, oh, I've been sitting with this pattern that comes up for me, and I think it's this need, and not kind of like putting that need on somebody else, but just sharing like, oh, wow, I really noticed that, really I was quite sad when I was eating all of that food. And I think the sadness is that, I wanted someone to be there by my side and tell me it's okay.
Mm.
And like, whoa, somebody doing that, like the permission that then gives others to go, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I'm not alone. Somebody else feels these things as well. And that feels like I'm imagining a world when we're all doing that.
Mm. Mm.
Like, what a shift there would be in our culture if that was like the norm. Mm.
And I want to add another piece into this, right? A bit of nervous system science, which is we're mammals, right? Oh, we're mammals, and mammalian nervous systems are designed to be in relationship with each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? You look at like a nest of mice, right? They're not all like separate, they're all snuggled up together.
Mm-hmm.
And from a nervous system kind of languaging, we call this co-regulation. So it's the ability for our nervous system to come into regulation in relationship with another nervous system.
Mm.
And the most regulated nervous system basically is sending out signals of safety,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so as children, our parents were kind of meant to have the most regulated nervous systems. And then we would move towards them when we were upset. They would hold us close to them. We'd get some oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone, released. We would co-regulate with their nervous system, and we'd come back into this place of like balance and ease and safety inside of ourselves.
Mm.
And so if we avoid connection when we're feeling triggered, wobbly, dysregulated, we're missing out on this opportunity to receive care directly from someone else's nervous system.
Mm.
And the interesting thing about co-regulation is that it's beyond words.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to be saying, well, now we're co-regulating, and can you? No,
Uh-huh.
right? It's just a case of like resting into someone else, or just sitting across someone else and just feeling their capacity and their resilience. And something in us then starts to calm down and to feel safe again.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, thank you for bringing in that piece. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating, the co-regulation piece, because as you say, it's not something that we switch on, like it's happening automatically. This is something our systems are designed to do, and therefore, like, why not use that functionality that's like built in? It's incredible. And one of the things that I sometimes hear from people who, are really struggling with trauma or like really activated nervous system is like it feels too out of reach actually to be with another human in that vulnerability or in that activation. And I've found it helpful. I'm interested to hear your take on this, but like I found it helpful to realize it doesn't have to be another person with you in person.
Yes.
It could also be with like a pet. Like you can co-regulate with animals, which is incredible. Like we could, sit with, if you have a pet dog or a pet cat, that can be a way that we're co-regulating. And again, we're doing that without having to think, oh, now I'm going to switch on my co-regulation. It's happening.
Yeah,
And some people find it regulating to be, I don't know, out in nature, you know,
totally.
go and walk among trees
Yeah,
or look at a lake or something like that. So
yeah.
if that feels inaccessible to you, it's not the only way to do it, to be like physically held. There are like other ways to support that.
And especially for people who've experienced relational trauma,
Mm,
then co-regulating in nature or pet is a starting point.
hmm.
Ultimately, we need to learn to co-regulate with another, right? To be able to
Yeah,
fully heal that trauma,
yeah.
right? So, and that journey can take as long as it takes.
Mm,
There's no timeline here. It's not like, oh, well, I've been co-regulating with my cat for a year now, and I should be able to go and, go to a snuggle party with people. It's like, no, when your system is ready, your system is ready.
hmm.
When you have capacity, you have capacity.
Mm,
This gets to take as long as it takes before
yeah.
we can find ourselves back into the safety of human connection.
Mm, mm, yeah. I think for me, like this was one of the things I really loved, and one of the main things I took away from sexological bodywork was that really um like utilizing co-regulation, but in a way that's super sort of calibrated, and like, you know, going at the pace of the person. Like in
Mm,
those sessions as a practitioner, you're never like, right, okay, well, your goal was to get to the point that you can do this. So like, let's just do that. Like, I love that approach that it kind of introduced me to, of everything just being, just enough. And then like coming back to safety, or a place that feels
mm,
that that person can then integrate that experience,
yeah,
just completely taking away that pressure of like, well, you need to get there by this
yeah, yeah,
point.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah. And
mm,
that's another piece about, healing trauma is that we do it in like little bite-sized chunks.
mm,
We call that kind of, we want experiences to be doable. So
mm.
coming into our inner landscape and feeling the traumas that we're holding, like the danger can be is that we go in and we get flooded. And then we're like, wow, that's way too intense. I'm not going back in there, back to
Mm,
numbing, right?
mm,
So we need to know that literally this is like dipping a toe in to the
mm,
shallow end rather than I'm going to jump headfirst into the deep end and
mm,
oh my goodness, I can't swim,
mm,
right? That's just creating more trauma in the system. And so
mm,
again, it points to this like needing to slow right down. And what can happen for people is that they arrive at their kind of healing with an urgency,
mhm,
with a timeline. Like, so I've got like about 6 months. Am I going to be fixed by the end of that time?
mm,
How many sessions is it going to take me? That's a
mhm,
question I used to get when I was doing more sessional work. And really, it's kind of inviting people into a whole new way of being with themselves,
mm,
a whole new relationship that, hey, this work of coming in and being in relationship with ourselves is a lifelong journey.
mhm,
Because, and I'm not saying that to deter anybody, but I'm saying that the more we do this, the more we get to feel, and within the context of like sexuality and intimacy, the more pleasurable experiences that we can create,
mm,
right?
mhm,
We don't
mm,
go from like shut down to multi-orgasmic
mm,
um, in 3 sessions with us like really pushing away to try and make something happen.
mm,
I know from my personal experience on my sexual healing journey, I went from very, very, very shut down to a point where I'm now, where I can experience so much pleasure. But that's
mm,
that's been a long journey to
mhm,
get to that place.
yeah,
And I know in a year's time I'll feel even more pleasure,
yeah,
right? Because I
yeah,
continue to keep showing up and feeling and embodying and integrating.
mm, mm. something really came up for me hearing you say that about how I sometimes encounter, and I think if I was to rewind time, I probably would have had this perspective as well, that there's almost like this separation in people's minds between doing like the fun, pleasurable stuff, like, I don't know, almost like exploring kink, or, you know, finding ways to be more orgasmic or to be orgasmic, or enjoying different things in sex. Like that's like the fun bucket of things that we can do as an exploration. And then there's just like this other bucket of like, oh, the healing stuff. And like people tend to see them as separate streams,
Yes.
or like an either or choice of like, oh, well, I'm going to just be healing. And then like, that's just all going to be really sad and depressing and like, oh, horrible hard work. And then like, once I've ticked that box, then I can do the pleasure stuff, or I'll just do the pleasure stuff because I don't want to look at that stuff. And I really want to challenge that in a way, because for me, like they kind of go hand in hand. That sounded a bit like what you were just saying, that like the more we're doing this work, the more pleasure is possible. So it's not just healing trauma for the sake of going into difficult experiences and feeling all the hard stuff, but in my experience, the more we expand in either direction, if you want to think of them as different directions, the more is possible. So the more I've been able to work with my own nervous system and feel some of the challenging things that came up for me around trauma, the more pleasure I've been able to feel. So it's just a general kind of, the more aware we are, the more we feel, and that's going to be more of everything. I don't think it's one directional, at least not in my experience.
Yeah, completely 100% agree with that.
So yeah, it doesn't have to all be sad. Like doing this
Yeah.
work opens you up to so much more capacity to be present and to really, I think for me as well, like to actually enjoy the fun stuff that I was doing. I was doing a lot of fun stuff in, you know, my younger years, early on in relationships, but I honestly spent at least 10 years of my life dissociated whenever I was experiencing anything like intimacy. So there's lots happening, but was it enjoyable? I don't know, because I wasn't really feeling anything. And so for me, it's like actually being able to be in my body enough to know what I want and to be able to feel it and to like, what's the word I'm looking for? When we're actually enjoying something, we're able to actually process it, then what I've noticed is I don't need as many or as big or as extreme experiences to feel something. Like I can really enjoy the subtlety of something now.
Yes. I'm so glad that you said that,
Mm.
because, you know, what I've seen in sexuality spaces are people going for like the real intensity. And it's because that's the only access point to feeling that they have, because the body is so shut down. We've got to have this really intense, either really intense sensation or really intense psychological experience in order to feel. And what I see working with clients, and again through my own journey, is getting to that place where we can just be in that like delicious subtlety, the nuance of sensation, and to experience so much pleasure from that. Because the body is open, the cells are vibrating,
Uh-huh.
your sensation comes in, it's just like, whoa, amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it really remarkable on my own sort of personal journey like that. Just how little I actually need of the thing I want when it's what I really want, and when I feel safe enough and open enough to fully receive it. And I think that's like, it feels like magic.
Yeah.
I remember having like some realization at some point that that's what was happening. I was like, oh wow, things like the 3 minute game and having like, a few minutes maximum of something that I really was actually what I wanted, and I could savor it. That was the word I was looking for. I could savor it. Then I was like, wow, I would have spent hours in the past, like doing lots of things, and sometimes I'd feel them and sometimes not, and sometimes I'd enjoy them and sometimes not. But wow, it does feel like magic when you're like, oh, I'm actually receiving this and feeling it and feeling safe and held. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
So all of that is possible as a result of, yeah, of getting to know yourself and your nervous system.
Mm.
And I wanted to speak just a little bit to, we said at the beginning about how sort of trauma and language around trauma is making its way into the mainstream. And you know, we hear lots of talk now. So on like Instagram, people will be posting things about kind of trauma or being triggered, and that kind of trauma and more broadly like therapy speak is becoming really mainstream. And I'm just wondering like how you kind of perceive that as someone who is a trauma specialist or nervous system specialist expert. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing that people are, you know, talking about trauma all the time now?
I mean, there's a place where I kind of go, because, you know, I see stuff being shared on social media that's incorrect, right? So there's incorrect advice being given, incorrect kind of explanations being given. So we are being exposed to information and we have to learn to become very discerning around this information, around where we're sourcing our information from. Excuse me. You know, historically, we used to have books that you'd go to and they'd be published and everything would be referenced and checked. And now, you know, social media means that anyone can post anything. So I think the first thing is just to be like, really only like listen to people who you've checked out and check that they've got like, you know, qualifications and they know what they're talking about. And then secondly, I think it's really important that we have an understanding of trauma and how it's impacted all of us, because then we can do something different, right? We can seek trauma resolution healing. We can do that on a kind of personal level, but also like on the collective level, we can start doing things differently. So that we're not creating more trauma for us and those people who are around us.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I feel like it's great that it's in people's awareness that trauma is a possibility and that people are, you know, the fact that it's becoming so mainstream, hopefully it's making people question like where that might be present or how that's showing up for people. But yeah, absolutely. Sort of practicing discernment around it, you know, someone's giving you very practical advice on what to do or diagnosing you via a TikTok video. Like maybe just check your sources. And I think that one of the things we spoke about before recording as well, which I think feels really relevant to this part, is what I can see sometimes is like therapy speak in general. So I won't go into trauma like specifically, but therapy speak becoming weaponized.
Yes.
And people then using it as a way to kind of enter into conflict. So like you've just triggered me now with that, and you've just triggered me. Well, I'm triggered now. You're triggered, and this kind of like that. I'm not saying that's not true. That might be what that person is feeling or they're experiencing, but when we kind of use it against each other and we're weaponizing it and it's becoming like a flippant remark of like, well, you're really triggering me, or this is like, you know, I'm traumatized by this now. I think whilst, you know, we want to honor those experiences that people are having and where that is true, I think what is missing in that is the piece that you mentioned before we started the recording about like, we also need a willingness to be in conversation.
Yes. Absolutely.
That is how we're going to, in my opinion, like we're going to heal our nervous systems individually and collectively through these generative conversations. I don't think we're going to heal it through like having a rupture in which I'm trying to prove that I'm more traumatized than you are, or you're triggering me more than I'm triggering you, or, it's, I think that's like the opposite of co-regulating in a way.
Totally.
Mm.
Totally. And, I think there's a space for learning how to have reparative conversations, which is first off, recognizing that there's a rupture that's happened. Secondly, taking responsibility for what's happening in your nervous system and where you've got triggered, and going off and processing what you need to process to bring yourself back into a regulated state so that you can have difficult conversations with each other. And so instead of it being you said this and I said that, we can actually be like, wow, where I got impacted in our conversation was here. And this is how it feels in my body. And this is how it feels emotionally for me.
Yeah.
And to be received in that is the healing. So instead of like, well, I didn't mean to, sorry, I'm croaky today. Instead of like being defensive and saying, well, that wasn't my intention. That's not the point. It's like an impact happened. Somebody's been hurt. Can we hold space for that?
Yeah. And that feels so different in my body hearing that than this idea that I sometimes hear that people are like, okay, so now I need to try and avoid all of everyone's trauma, which is just like this impossible idea of like, oh, someone told me this is triggering, so now I'm just never going to do that again. And then, oh, well, that's triggering for someone. And it's like, yes, we can be considerate in our actions, but actually, I think what feels more supportive is what you said, is like to work on being aware of ourselves and what our patterns are and what things tend to activate us, and to really commit and take our personal responsibility when we feel activated or dysregulated by something, to go away and regulate ourselves and to look at what was going on for us. And like the difference I feel from someone just trying to be like, oh, don't want to like trip up on your trauma, versus someone like really listening and hearing me say, whoa, I noticed in that conversation when you said that, I could feel my body getting like my jaw was getting tense, and this was happening. And actually, I think what was going on for me was ... And someone just hearing that and seeing me in that experience, like that's so different and so much more helpful than someone being like, whoop, don't want to say anything that's going to trigger you.
Yeah.
Because
if we're walking on eggshells, we're not being authentic. We're people pleasing, which is a trauma pattern.
Yeah.
And we're doing that in order to maintain connection. But we're not being a safe person by behaving in that way, because there's a lack of coherence in ourselves.
Yeah.
A lack of authenticity, a lack of integrity. And so, in my vision of the world, it's like we get to be ourselves, where inevitably we're going to upset other people, where ruptures are going to happen. But the difference is that we are willing and skilled enough to be able to have reparative conversations that bring about more intimacy, ultimately.
Oh, yes. Yes, please. Wow. I'm just letting that land for a moment because, wow. Yeah. I really, really hope that that's the direction that we're going in with this. I really do. I'm curious. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So this isn't a super long episode because there's so much we could get into here. I'm curious then, we've spoken about lots of different ways in which people can, do some of the work to understand their own nervous systems some more. And we've talked about some of the ways in which, we can bring this into the relational aspects.
Mm.
So hopefully there's plenty of tips in here for people who are kind of hearing this kind of stuff for the first time, or a reminder to those of you who are maybe forgetting some of these practices. But where else can people kind of learn this stuff? So I'm curious where people can find you, what kind of things people can do with you, what are the bits of work that you offer at the moment?
So I offer one-to-one containers where we do the deep nervous system and emotional healing work. I have held group containers where we do nervous system based practices and healing in community. For anyone who's a practitioner or facilitator, I'm offering a professional training starting next year, where you can learn how to do this and take it into your work. Yeah.
Amazing. Could you give us the name of the practitioner training? Because I know that there's quite a lot of practitioners out there who constantly ask me for this kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I'm doing it in collaboration with somebody called Rachel Rickards, and her body of work's called The Field, and my body of work's called Culture of Care. So we brought those two together. So Rachel teaches facilitation skills, and I'm teaching the trauma-informed training. And so it's called The Field Online, this training. It's got a much longer name, but that's what we've abbreviated it to. I can give you the link for that training so that people can have access to that.
Amazing. So we'll pop your links, including the link to that training, in the show notes for this. Anything else that you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up? Any final words?
I mean, if by listening to this, you're feeling maybe a bit tender, maybe you're like, oh, perhaps I've got trauma, maybe this is the first time you've kind of joined the dots up, know that you're not alone, and that there is a lot of help out there for you, and that you get to take your trauma healing journey at whatever pace feels right for you. And that you don't need to go into these deep, dark, scary places all by yourself. And that it is possible to heal, and it is possible to feel way more pleasure and deeper intimacy, and just to feel safer in general in your life.
Oh, gorgeous. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to come on and share your wisdom with us. I feel like it's such a rich topic that I imagine we'll be asked to go further into this at some point. But it's been an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. And I'm feeling lots from what you've shared in my own body. I can feel lots being stirred up. So it's really, thank you for holding such beautiful body of work, and it's really, really needed. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lex, for your invitation to join you on your podcast. It's been a real pleasure to be here and to share what I can with your listeners.
Thank you so much. All right, bye for now.
Bye.
Well, thank you for listening to the conversation with Catherine. I wasn't just trying to stroke Catherine's ego at the beginning by saying that, I'm in awe of her work. I've genuinely, for the last however many years, several years now, been aware of Catherine, and she really is the person I would go to for training, the person I would signpost people to as a true expert in this space. And there's lots of people out there who sort of claim that title, but in all that I know and have experienced of Catherine, she truly embodies this work. And that's a really important thing, learning how to be trauma informed or trauma aware as a space holder, practitioner, facilitator, but also, you know, the other roles that we hold in our life where we're responsible for others, you know, as a teacher or a therapist or a parent. You know, a massive, massive part of this is not about, you know, having a shiny set of tools that you can use if trauma comes up, but it's as much about looking after our own nervous system. The more that we can regulate ourselves, the more we can be available for that co-regulation that we were talking about. And I love how, you know, we mentioned that, you know, we're all swimming in trauma and overwhelm. We're all very likely feeling frazzled, at least some of the time at the moment, in the way that our culture is, you know, this constantly striving and working and constantly overwhelmed by information and sensory input. And I love that there was lots of practical bits of advice that Catherine gave in this, you know, about slowing down. Like, there's one thing you take away from it, like just slow down enough to notice your feelings, notice sensation in your body, notice what thoughts are going through your mind. And like when you have capacity to really getting curious about why we do the things that we do. You know, so why do you reach for your phone? Why do you turn to alcohol or drugs? Or why do you pick your phone up? Why do you constantly pursue new connections? What is the need that's underneath that that's maybe unmet? And I think that, you know, we can do that with compassion and know that all of these strategies are probably coming from a very young version of us and that we're all doing it. You're not on your own. And if we do find ourselves coming up against, you know, activation with somebody else in a rupture or something that we do has an impact on other people, I think just being willing to engage in those conversations, giving ourselves permission to pause and notice what's going on for us, and permission to change our minds if we're in the middle of doing something and we realize that actually you know, we don't feel able to, or our nervous systems feel too dysregulated. And like the final note is just, you know, pleasure is possible. Like even if you feel like you've experienced loads of trauma or you feel constantly overwhelmed or dysregulated, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get to a place where you can experience pleasure. And by really getting to know ourselves and how our nervous systems are, that is the way to it. That is the way to pleasure that you're going to actually be able to feel and be able to integrate and savor. So yeah, I just really hope that you got as much out of this conversation as I did. I talk about trauma a lot in my work, and yet hearing Catherine, you know, it was bringing up stuff for me about my patterns and how I've kind of navigated this throughout my life. So, yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the podcast. And thank you to the team, Molly and Tom, as always, for the awesome work that you do behind the scenes to make this possible. And a huge thank you again to Catherine for being a fantastic guest. And yeah, hopefully we'll have more on this in future. All right, bye for now.